Hello, and thank you for the opportunity. My name's John Innis. I'm with the EPA division. I'm a senior scientific officer in the air quality section. Today I'm going to talk about smoke and air quality in the Tasmanian context. In a broad sense, the main air quality issue in Tasmania is smoke. Compared to the mainland, we don't have the large population centres, we don't have the photochemical smog, and we don't have a lot of heavy industry. But we do have smoke from planned burning, from wildfires, from bushfires, and from domestic heat sources. Just taking the first one in planned burning, there's a lot of reasons why planned burning takes place, and in a sense, given they all produce smoke, the reasons are probably secondary in the air quality context. But from the forest industry, agriculture, environmental management burns, hazard reduction burns, and also just general waste removal. Historically, the largest burner in Tasmania, certainly by total fuel tonnage, has been the forestry industry. Well, that's fallen off a bit recently. But when we've had the heavy native forest logging, the burns there in the hardwood forests, the non-target species and the residue is burnt. And this often leads to very large fuel loadings per tonne, around 600 hectares of tonne of fuel, and about 400 tonnes of that is burnt in the fire. They get about a 60% efficiency. So that's a lot of fuel going up. In plantation burns, the residue is not as heavy, maybe 100 to 150 tonnes per hectare. You can compare that to an environmental burn or a fuel reduction burn in a living forest, where you're just burning through the undergrowth and the leaf litter. You might be of order of 5 to 10 tonnes per hectare, or an agricultural crop residue burn, also about that size. Now, obviously, the amount of fuel you produce is going to be directly related to the amount of smoke that you produce. Just as an idea of of a heavy forest burn, this is in a coop in the northwest of Tasmania. This is what's left over after the harvesting. So there's a lot of fine fuel, bark, small branches and leaves, and also quite a lot of heavy fuel left over in stumps and other bits of wood. When they are ignited, often in the autumn, this is down in the Huon region a couple of years ago, a photograph that appeared in the Mercury newspaper. The very big hot burns start off with big convective columns, but it's often when the burns enter a smouldering phase and the smoke doesn't get up to altitude, that's when we get the air quality impacts at the ground level. We also have bushfires, and I won't speak too much about that because they're uncontrolled, and we only can react, we can't be proactive there. This is southern Tasmania, from sort of the view from sort of Launceston down to Hobart in January this year, 2013. This was about the 1 or 2 days after the very hot day, and the wind had dropped a little bit and the smoke was starting to disperse. But fires up near Bicheno, up near the steppes, Lake Repulse through the Derwent Valley, the Denali fire, of course, and then in the west coast as well, at Giblin River. And huge amount of smoke over a lot of Tasmania, and quite severe impacts, particularly in the Huon region, for several days. Domestic wood heaters. The current figures suggest there's about 60,000 wood heaters in Tasmania. There's about 200,000 households, so that's about 30% of the households are using them mainly, and often in the smaller communities and towns, not so much in Launceston and Hobart, at least the central areas. The number of wood heaters in Tassie had been falling, but the indications are it may be starting to increase again. Generally speaking, the wood heating season is April to October, in the colder months. And the issue really for this is it's generated where people live, rather than being away from the community, up in a forestry area or somewhere like that, or an agricultural area. It's actually right in the town where people live. Wood heater use increases on cold, calm nights, and that limits the opportunity for smoke dispersal. Each source of smoke has its own particular issues. The two areas of concern for the EPA are the planned burn smoke and the domestic heating smoke. Up until 2009, for various reasons, most of our air quality monitoring was either in Launceston, Hobart, or 2 stations in the Lower Tamar. The stations also didn't report in real time, so often we didn't get a feel for what was happening until some weeks later. The spatial cover of the monitoring was poor in Tasmania. To rectify this, in early 2009, we started commissioning Blanket, the baseline air network of EPA Tasmania, initially with 5 stations in the northeast, and then later in 2009 into the Huon. As of today, we now have 26 stations across Tasmania reporting real-time data to our web pages, public web pages. And we're using that expanded network to monitor and increase our knowledge of both the planned burn smoke and also domestic wood heater smoke. And we pick up the bushfire smoke as well. If you go to our web page, and this was just a shot I grabbed from last night, each black dot represents a station, and there's the instantaneous PM10 and PM2.5 value, and there was a bit of smoke down in the south, so the red values down in New Norfolk, in Hobart, and down in Geeveston. There was a bit of smoke about. A little bit of wind about in the north, so the smoke didn't tend to build up. As an example of planned burn smoke, and I won't spend a great deal of time talking about it because I want to move more on to the domestic wood smoke in this talk. But in mid-April 2010, there was very poor air quality in the Huon. This slide shows 11 days in the middle of April, from the 14th through to the 25th of April, from our three stations, Huonville, Judbury and Geeveston. The red line represents the PM2.5, which is the better indicator of smoke. And we had a number of days of very high elevated smoke concentrations, a number of days over the NEPM reporting standard, advisory standard for PM2.5. And this smoke was largely due to a number of forestry burns that took place at this time. These data, we believe, were the first time we actually had widespread air quality monitoring in the region, in the Huon, during the interval of intensive burning. So it was the first sort of data that Blanket was producing here. When we actually did a bit of analysis on this, this plot compares the burn loads, how much was burnt on any given day, and the air quality response at the three stations. The dotted line with the crosses and the small dots represent the fuel loading that was burnt, estimated fuel loading, and the dashed lines of the different colours represent the air stations. In early April there was a fair bit of burning, but the ventilation index, which is calculated by the Bureau of Meteorology, as in how well smoke disperses, was reasonably high, and we didn't see much of an air quality impact. Later in April, when the ventilation index was poor or very poor and the burning took place, the air stations responded with a lag of about half a day or a day and basically mimicked the amount of burning. This is one of the first times we've been able to quantify and capture this sort of information. The reason why the air stations had about a 0.5 or 1 day lag is because a lot of the burning took place in the afternoon on one day and the impacts came in a few hours later, often after midnight. In part because of this, the Forest Practices Authority, which regulate the forestry industry, undertook a review, and they formally codified an idea of a no burning day, which means that if an air station on a given day at 9 o'clock in the morning is recording 25 micrograms per cubic metre or higher, then a no burning day is declared in that airshed. This is to stop smoke being added to an already polluted airshed, and in large part was a direct consequence of the case study from the April in 2010 in the Huon. Just fast forwarding to last year, in March in 2013, after there was smoke again in the Huon. Their burns were conducted on the previous day on the 13th, and then on the morning of the 14th, the smoke moved down the river valleys into the three air stations. The difference on this day was that because at 9 o'clock the air quality was poor, that meant that the 14th was a no burning day, and so smoke couldn't be added to the airshed, so that was a no burning day. So there's been a little bit of active management, if you like, based on the air quality data. The other thing we did on the 14th is we now have a system called Travel Blanket, which I'll mention again shortly, which is a car-based monitoring system, and we actually did a survey through the Huon on that morning, and we actually mapped out in large part where the smoke was around at least the upper part of the Huon Valley, where is in Huonville and Geeveston. Okay, the other main issue, as we talked about, is domestic wood heating smoke. Largely confined to April to October, although in some places you will see wood heaters producing smoke at other times of the year. Wood heater use tends to be very high in the smaller communities, perhaps up to 60% or 70%, whereas in Hobart and Launceston other forms of heating tend to be more dominant, at least in the central parts of the towns. Cold, calm nights, when you're likely wanting to use your wood heater, there's often a temperature inversion forms, which basically puts a lid on vertical movement. And a calm night means there's not much horizontal movement, not much wind, and so smoke dispersal is very poor. What we have seen now from our blanket network, because we've gone out into the small communities, and particularly with Travel Blanket, which allows us to move into a community and do several hours worth of monitoring on a night at a fairly effective and efficient way of doing it, is we've actually found a lot of these communities do experience poor or very poor wintertime air quality. Just to give you an example, mainly look at the top plot. This is Launceston Tea Tree Bend from 2010. The top plot shows the day value, the day average of PM 2.5 for the entire year. So each point represents one day. Early on in the summertime there's some bushfires. In March there was some smoke moved across the mainland from Victoria. Moving into April, a bit of planned burn smoke. The planned burn impacts weren't so severe in 2010 in Launceston as perhaps they have been in other years. And then we move into the wintertime wood smoke, and you can see that quite a clear pattern in winter. Now, of those values, there were 11 values that were over the NEPM reporting standard of 25 micrograms per cubic metre. So the day average for 11 days in Launceston in 2010 was over the NEPM reporting standard. That's in Launceston, which is known to have an air quality problem. In the same year in Geeveston, it's a small town of a few hundred houses, we actually had 62 days above the NEPM reporting standard. You can see in April the forest burn-offs in the Huon. You can see that affect a very large spike. And then moving into the winter time, you can see that generally speaking, the smoke's very high. The low values are on windy nights when the smoke's blown away. But we had 62 nights there, so 62 days of poor air quality in Geeveston. Geeveston itself is in a bit of a bowl in the valley. There are hills surrounding it. There's drainage, cold air drainage into the valleys. The only way out is through the Huon Highway back towards the river, towards Port Huon. Not much air can move, it's fairly stagnant, and we suspect the smoke just builds up. Cold nights, a good smoke inversion. So although we only have a few houses, in a sense, a handful, a couple of hundred houses compared to Launceston's population, the smoke levels build up and they don't disperse. With such a data set, we can start to look at the data in other different ways. This is, if you like, a three-dimensional plot. Along the horizontal axis, along the horizontal one, we have time of day. I've marked 8 p.m. and 6 o'clock in the morning. The vertical axis represents the temperature at any given time. These are hourly average data. And the colour, or the contour, the third dimension, represents the smoke levels. You can see that after about 8 o'clock at night, on a cold night, the orangey colour, the smoke comes in. And on the coldest nights, that persists all the way through to about 2 or 4 o'clock in the morning. The strong temperature inversion, very calm conditions on the very cold nights, the smoke just doesn't disperse. With travel blanket now, which was just one of our smoke measuring machines combined with a GPS for positioning information and a PC to log data, we can actually go out into a community and spend 3 or 4 hours very quickly getting a feel for both the spatial distribution of the smoke in the community and also the smoke levels. And using this instrument, we've actually been able to do a really good survey of a number of towns, and we can actually now demonstrate that we really do have air quality problems in wintertime in even relatively small communities. This is a view in Lorraine, a very pretty little town. One morning in August, a frosty morning, looking down West Barrack Street back towards the river, and you can see quite a lot of smoke in the distance down at the bottom of the hill, and a few particular local spots from some houses, some chimneys. What this actually was showing us as we went later on at some more surveys the following year is that there's actually quite a spatial variation of smoke in Lorraine. This is a plan view of a travel blanket survey. The blue symbols represent fairly low smoke, almost clean air. The green represent higher smoke, and the red represent values over 100 micrograms per cubic metre. So the red values are actually very, very high smoke. The greens are more like 50s. If you look at the picture slightly at an angle, and also the height of the dot above the local ground level, it gives you a measure of the smoke as well. We've just drawn it so that a value of 100 micrograms per cubic metre appears 100 metres above local ground level, so you get a bit of a scale that way. You can see there's a concentration of greens and reds in the valley. That's the West Barrack Street gully. The smoke basically flows into that. The cold air drains into the valley and it moves the smoke into it, and we get very large smoke concentrations building up, particularly down towards the river there. So it's quite a marked effect, and we've seen this 3 or 4 times in Lorraine, and we think it's a fairly common feature of cold, calm nights. We've also looked at places like Hadspen, up near Launceston. Hadspen has a similar sort of geographical confinement to Geeveston in a sense. In this case, it's the river. The South Esk is forming almost three sides or two sides around the town, and there's some higher ground back towards the east and the north. So it's a fairly stagnant, not a very open pool of air. The red values represent very high smoke levels, the greens medium levels, and the blue low smoke. What's particularly interesting from Hadspen, and we've seen this on a few nights as well, is that the smoke levels are really very high. A couple of thousand, or maybe 1,500 households in the area, 1,300 households, but again, very high smoke levels. Taking a wider view of that survey, which now goes out to Carrick, you can see Carrick's got a bit of smoke around it as well. But what's interesting is on the road up there to Westwood, those green values on that bit of the survey path at right angles to the Hadspen and Carrick line, that's going across the Meander River Valley. And actually the plume from Hadspen was moving basically up the Meander River, all the way up almost, well, up past Carrick, but we couldn't find a road to monitor on. We did a transect going north to Westwood from the Meander Valley Road and then back again. And if you look at that in a time series, you can see even though we were 3 kilometres from the town on both the northward and the southward transect, that we peaked at about 50 micrograms per cubic metre just as we crossed the river. So here's an effect of a town producing quite a significant amount of smoke even 3 kilometres away from it. We've actually seen from Launceston that the smoke from Launceston can move all the way down the river through Exeter and even at Georgetown on certain times as well. So certainly the smoke can move. Another example would be New Norfolk. This is a plan view of New Norfolk. The red values again represent high smoke, and we've actually done several surveys in New Norfolk, and we've consistently found that the Magra side of the river, which is probably the most dense residentially, is where most of the smoke forms. Again, we get a few cold winds coming down from the Magra Valley and some of the other valleys, and we believe the smoke, again, whether there's some sort of stagnation where they join the main flow down the Derwent, or whether it's just a very, very high, a choke out through the river down towards Boyer, but the air doesn't seem to mix very well and the smoke levels build up. Just as another example, Latrobe. That's a reasonably open place, but again we found very high levels, particularly in the main residential area to the south of Gilbert Street. So across a number of towns now we've seen this at night in relatively small communities, and we probably didn't expect that based on what the standard thought that you need a large population centre to produce a lot of smoke, but we've actually found that if you have conditions that inhibit dispersion, you do get large smoke build up. One thing that was also of interest was we looked at Scottsdale. Now we've had a station at Scottsdale, or near Scottsdale, for a couple of years, since 2009. The station itself is about 2 kilometres from Scottsdale. So it doesn't actually sample the air from Scottsdale directly, but it was used to sample planned burn smoke in the general airshed. The station is on a small rise and it's reasonably windy location, and Scottsdale itself would share some of that characteristics. So we assumed that there'd be not too much of a problem with wintertime wood smoke in Scottsdale because we thought the wind would be blowing it away. But we wanted to check it out, so we managed to find a location to put in a small monitoring station just a couple of 100 metres from the main shopping area of Scottsdale, and we actually found extremely high levels. On this panel is the day average value from our monitoring, and we only monitored from the 12th of August to the 12th of September in 2012, so that's late winter. But we actually found of those 30 days or so, 17 days were above the Nepean limit. So about 2/3 of the time we were above the limit. So that's actually really smoky. When we look into the days at detail, we actually find that we're not getting a general increase in poor air as such, but we're getting a lot of short-lived events. We believe these are just smoke signatures of individual smoke plumes moving backwards and forwards around the monitoring station. But there's enough of the plumes and there's enough smoke being produced to, on average, give you very high average levels of smoke. To confirm that, we did a survey of Scottsdale. This was again late winter, on 10th of September 2012. But we did find certainly a large number of plumes, and certainly they were contributing to that general level, even though the smoke wasn't hanging around if there was any little bit of wind about. If we do a composite day of Scottsdale, and this is actually one of the most interesting things, if you take all the days for that month and you add them all together and look at the hourly averages, you can actually get this sort of plot. What we see is that about 5 o'clock in the evening, the smoke levels rise. Between 5 and 6 o'clock, they fall off again. They rise again at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, then fall through the night, and there's another peak around 6 or 7 in the morning. This seems to be related to people's use of wood heaters, and in particular that large peak about 10 o'clock at night, we believe is the heaters being loaded up and then being closed down, and they tend to smoulder. Now the dips in between the peaks is because the wind is blowing the smoke away. In a place like Geeveston, or where there's limited air dispersal, that'd be a much smoother plot. But here we're actually seeing more the emissions rather than the concentrations that result. And that's actually a really interesting result. With our Burn Brighter program, which is slowly being rolled out, we're particularly targeting that 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock shutdown, that when people load up their wood heaters, they need to take care that they've actually got a really good flame going before they shut it down. Just to summarise then, the smoke, bushfire, the wildfire smoke, it's highly variable from year to year, and it can impact on locations where we move from the source of the fire. But we do get some years where we get little smoke and some years where we get more smoke. The planned burn smoke tends to have been mainly in the autumn, but we are seeing more fuel reduction burns which tend to take place in the spring. We can get significant smoke and significant smoke impacts on both local and regional scales, and on occasions we may get several days of smoke. The impact areas tend to vary a bit from season to season, although in certain areas, probably like the Huon and perhaps in the northwest, we're likely to see impacts more often each year. Domestic heating smoke the impact tends to be local to the town or community, but it's occurring all through the winter and tends to have the potential to severely impact where people are, and hence the exposure that people will get from that could be high. People sometimes ask me which is worse, the planned burn smoke or the domestic heating smoke. Well, the answer is they're all bad, and we're trying to do our best to reduce the exposure to all. Just to conclude, what we now have with our air monitoring is the potential to have a much better understanding of what's going on with smoke concentrations and smoke movement. We are getting quantitative data which we can feed back and use to refine the management of smoke from planned burns, and we're getting a whole new window on wintertime wood smoke concentrations in Tasmanian towns and communities. We are continuing to develop both the measurement techniques and our analysis techniques for the blanket data set, and a lot of the information that we have gathered so far is available on our reports page on our EPA web. And we do have an inquiries number. We welcome your feedback and or comments, and we do thank the very many people who've contributed to making Blanket a reality, in particular the people who have hosted our stations. Thank you.